In this video, we are going to be exploring the stress response. This is Chapter 18, Part 12. So it really is impossible to remove all the stress from our everyday lives. So some stress, which is called eustress, actually prepares us to meet certain challenges, and therefore it's actually quite helpful. Now, other stress is called distress, and this is actually harmful stress. So any stimulus that produces a stress response is called a stressor. Now your body's homeostatic mechanisms are going to attempt to counteract any stress. So to keep that balance, when you're stressed, the body wants to maintain that internal environment within normal physiological limits. If the stress is too extreme or unusual or very long-lasting, the normal mechanisms to maintain homeostasis might not actually be enough. Now, the stress response occurs in 3 stages. So the first stage of the stress response is the initial fight or flight response. Then we're going to come into a slower resistance reaction. So this is where we're kind of building up resistance. And then eventually the final stage of the stress response is exhaustion. Now the fight or flight response stimulates the body for immediate activity. And then the resistance reaction is the second stage, and it lasts a lot longer than the first response. Now the stress response brings huge amounts of glucose and oxygen to organs that are going to be most active in warding off danger. So this is going to be things like the brain, which has to become extremely alert, skeletal muscles, which have to either fight off an attacker or run away. Also, the heart, which has to work really hard to pump enough blood to the brain and the muscles. So in this diagram on the right, we have red arrows here, these red arrows, that are going to indicate hormonal responses, and green arrows that indicate neural responses. We're also going to have these black arrows as well on the right side here, and these are going to indicate long-term resistance reactions. So here we have a stressor come in and stimulate the hypothalamus, and the fight or flight response is initiated by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So you can see this is a very short-lived response. It's going to go through the sympathetic nerves to the adrenal medulla, and then to these visceral effectors that we've talked about before, these sympathetic responses like an increased heart rate, dilation of blood vessels, for the heart, lungs, and brain and skeletal muscles, and then constriction of blood vessels for the gut and digestive organs. Also dilation of airways, so you can bring in more air, and then sweating as well, are just a couple of these sympathetic responses that are elicited by that fight or flight response, that quite short-lived response. It's all nerve responses. Now, on the other hand, the resistance reaction is initiated in large part by those hypothalamic releasing hormones, and it's going to be a much longer lasting response. So here we have these red arrows are going to indicate the resistance reaction. So we're going to look at these, the corticotropin releasing hormone, the growth hormone releasing hormone, and the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which are going to go and act upon the anterior pituitary to secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone, the human growth hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. And these will act on their respective organs, and we've talked about these before. These responses to the adrenal cortex releasing cortisol, the liver releasing insulin-like growth factors, and the thyroid gland releasing thyroid hormones. And we've discussed what each of these hormones does individually, but we're seeing that they are really involved in the stress response, in long-term stress response, in this long resistance reaction here. So here, this is where we're also going to see the specific responses for each of these hormones, or what they affect. And again, we've talked a little bit about this as well. This is pretty much their general roles is what they're going to carry through during that stress response. So pretty important here to remember that fight or flight, mainly by nerve impulses, and then all the hormones that are affected by the longer by the longer lasting response, the resistance reaction. And that's the end of Chapter 18, Part 12.